The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world hasn't started yet. Lake Michigan stretching out endlessly in front of you, steel gray and still beneath a sky that hasn't decided what kind of day it wants to be. Warnemont Park in Cudahy, Wisconsin. A place where families come to walk their dogs, where joggers trace out their morning miles, where children feed ducks along the water's edge and grandparents sit on benches watching the lake do what it has always done, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, unchanged by everything happening on the shore around it. It is the second day of April, 2024. And what a parkgoer discovers along that shoreline on this particular Tuesday afternoon will shatter the quiet of that community, and of an entire city, in ways that no one is prepared for and no one will ever fully recover from. It is 5:30 in the evening when the call comes in to police. A severed human leg has been found. That is where this story begins, on the surface. With a discovery so horrific that the officers who respond cannot yet understand the scale of what they are looking at. They do not yet know that this leg is the beginning, not the end, of a nightmare. They do not yet know that within the next 4 days, they will be responding to 3 more scenes scattered across the greater Milwaukee area, each one more devastating than the last. They do not yet know that every single piece of evidence they collect, every surveillance frame they pull, every witness they sit down with, is going to point them toward one man. A 33-year-old bartender. The son of a Milwaukee millionaire. A man with a documented history of violence against women who had been walking freely through the city for years while the record of who he was sat in a courthouse file and nobody connected the dots. And they do not yet know her name. Shadeai Robinson. 19 years old. 1 month away from her college degree. A girl who painted her toenails pink before going out for dinner on a Monday night in early April, and who left her apartment building that evening with the uncomplicated, ordinary optimism of a young person heading out into the world she was in the middle of building for herself. A girl whose disappearance her mother had already felt in her bones before anyone else was willing to say the word out loud. This is the missing truth. And this is the story of Shadeai Robinson. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, if it makes you angry, if it makes you want to do something, like this video right now, leave a comment. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of The Missing Truth. Because stories like Shadeai's deserve to be heard. They deserve to echo. They deserve to be told and retold and told again until the world refuses to look away. We do this for her. Let's begin. Before we talk about what was found, and what was done, and who did it, we have to start where every story like this one actually begins. Not at the crime scene. Not at the arrest. Not at the moment a parkgoer looked down at a shoreline and could not believe what they were seeing. We have to start at the person. Because Shadeai Robinson was not a headline. She was not a case number. She was not a body part discovered on the shore of Lake Michigan on a Tuesday afternoon in April. She was a human being of extraordinary character and extraordinary promise, and if we are going to do right by her, if we are going to tell her story the way it deserves to be told, then we have to start at the beginning of who she was. Shadeai Robinson grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She was the eldest of 2 daughters raised by her mother, Sheena Scarrow, a community advocate who described her family as light workers, people who live their lives in service of others, who pour positive energy into the world and ask nothing in return. That was the household Shadeai came from. That was the soil she was planted in. And it shows in every single documented detail of who she became. She was a student of remarkable discipline. At Riverside High School in Milwaukee, she did not merely graduate, she graduated with honors, and she did it a full semester early. Let that land for a moment. While her classmates were still settling into their senior year routines, planning prom and counting down to their final exams, Shadeai Robinson was already done. Already moving forward. Already one step ahead of where anyone expected her to be. That was who she was. Not someone who waited for the system to move at its own pace and carried her along with it. Someone who moved faster than the system because she had places to be and she intended to get there. She enrolled at Milwaukee Area Technical College shortly after finishing high school, pursuing an associate's degree in criminal justice. The choice of field was not accidental and it was not random. She was drawn to the law. She was drawn to justice, to accountability, to the idea that the systems meant to protect people should actually protect people, and that someone needed to be in those systems who genuinely understood why that mattered. Her father, Carlos Robinson, said that her ultimate goal was to become a lawyer. She also had deep admiration for the military. Both of her uncles had served, and she had been seriously considering a career with the United States Air Force. She had not yet made that final decision because she was 19 years old and she had time. She had options. She had a mind sharp enough and a work ethic strong enough and a will determined enough to pursue any road she chose to walk down. The world was genuinely and completely open to her. At the time of her disappearance in early April of 2024, Shadeai Robinson was 1 month away from completing that degree. 1 single month. Approximately 30 days stood between her and the diploma she had worked for across years of early mornings and late shifts and fully loaded academic terms. She worked. She worked hard, and she worked consistently, and she did so without complaint and without exception. For years, through high school and into college, Shadeai held a job at Pizza Shuttle on Milwaukee's Lower East Side. This was not a casual arrangement she dropped in and out of when it suited her. This was a real, sustained commitment. She showed up for every shift, reliably and thoroughly, the kind of employee that managers build their operations around because they know that person is going to be there. Her former employer, Mark Gold, described her in terms that stopped a lot of people cold when they heard it. He said she was the type of employee who never called out. Who was loved by the customers. Who made the place feel different just by being in it. He called her the heart of Pizza Shuttle. The heart. You do not say that about an employee unless they have genuinely left something of themselves in that place. Unless their presence has changed the culture of where they work in ways that are real and felt and missed when they are gone. Shadeai Robinson, at 19 years old, had done exactly that. By the spring of 2024, she was holding down not 1 but 2 jobs simultaneously while carrying a full course load at Milwaukee Area Technical College. She had her own apartment, a 1-bedroom she paid for herself. She had her own car, which she also paid for herself. Every single bill that came through that apartment door had her name on it and her money attached to it. She was not living on loans from family members. She was not leaning on anyone. She was 19 years old, functionally independent, academically excellent, professionally reliable, and preparing to step into the world with a set of credentials she had earned without asking anyone to carry them for her. Her mother would later say, with a mixture of awe and grief that is almost impossible to hold in your chest while you listen to it, there are things my daughter did that many adults were not able to accomplish in their lifetimes. She was not exaggerating. Shadeai was close to her family. Her mother Sheena, her grandmother, her grandfather, her aunties, her uncles, many of them veterans, her younger sister, who was 16 years old at the time of the events we are about to discuss. The family used a shared location application, a feature that allowed all of them to check in on one another, to know where everyone was, to feel connected even when their busy and productive individual lives kept them physically apart. It was the kind of thing a close-knit family does without thinking much about it. A quiet digital extension of the care they had for each other. She came home for Easter Sunday of 2024. She sat at her grandparents' table. She ate her mother's cooking. She spent the afternoon with the people who loved her most in the world. She smiled that smile, the one that photographs so well, the one her former employer described as crackling with intelligence and joy, the one you look at in pictures and feel, somehow, as though you can actually see her personality radiating outward into the room around her. It was the last time her family would see her alive. Her mother Sheena had been feeling something in the weeks before Easter. Something she could not name but could not dismiss either. A vibration of unease. A mother's intuition working overtime, telling her to hold her daughter closer, to warn her to be careful about who she was spending time with and where she was going. She had been putting this feeling into Shadeai's ear consistently in the weeks leading up to that Easter Sunday. Be careful. I don't trust these people in Milwaukee. Just be mindful. And Shadeai, as 19-year-olds do, as young people who are competent and independent and proud of that independence do, had gently pushed back. Had told her mother to relax. Had asked for a little space, a little room to be the adult she had already proven herself to be. That is not a failure on Shadeai's part. That is not naivety. That is a young woman living her life the way she had every right to live it, trusting the world to behave the way a world full of decent people should behave. That is a young woman doing everything right. The world did not cooperate. And somewhere in the city of Milwaukee, a 33-year-old man with a documented history of violence against women, a basement he had been carefully modifying for months, and a hole dug in his backyard wide enough and deep enough and precisely shaped enough to hold a human body, was watching her. Every story has more than one thread. And to understand what happened to Shadeai Robinson, we have to understand something about the man investigators believe is responsible for her death. Not to excuse him. Not to soften the edges of what he allegedly did. But because understanding who Maxwell Stephen Anderson was, and how someone like him could exist in plain sight for as long as he did, moving freely through the world, working behind bars in public spaces, meeting new people, while his record sat in a courthouse file that nobody put in front of anyone who needed to see it, that understanding is part of what makes this case so deeply, urgently important. Maxwell Stephen Anderson was 33 years old in April of 2024. He lived in the 3100 block of South 39th Street in West Milwaukee, in a home that, from the outside, was described by neighbors and people who knew the area as well maintained. Neat yard. Immaculate, even, by some accounts. The kind of house that blends into its surroundings without drawing any particular attention. The kind of house that neighbors walk past every morning and every evening without thinking twice about what might be happening on the other side of its walls. Anderson had been a high school football star. That detail matters not because athletic achievement predicts anything about a person's character, but because it establishes the arc of his public reputation. He was someone who, at one point in his life, had been admired and recognized and celebrated. He had been a standout. And standouts leave impressions. They build loyalties. They accumulate people around them who are slow to revise their mental picture of who someone is, even when the evidence begins to demand it. The person you cheered for on the field is not the person you easily believe capable of what Maxwell Anderson has been charged with. That gap, between the image and the reality, is something predators of this kind are very good at maintaining. By the spring of 2024, Anderson was working as a bartender. He had worked at multiple establishments in the Milwaukee area over the years, including a seafood restaurant called the Twisted Fisherman and a nightclub called Victor's. Those locations are not incidental to this story. They are going to matter in ways that become clearer as we move through the timeline. Anderson came from money. His father had run a successful insurance brokerage firm in Milwaukee and was reported to be a millionaire. That family wealth had provided Anderson with certain cushions throughout his life, the kind of cushions that tend to insulate people from the full, lasting consequences of their behavior when that behavior brings them into contact with the legal system. And Maxwell Anderson had been in contact with the legal system. Repeatedly. Because Maxwell Anderson had a criminal record. And we are not talking about a single youthful mistake that a young man learned from and carried forward as a cautionary story. We are talking about a pattern. A documented, court-recorded, adjudicated pattern of dangerous and violent behavior. Anderson had been convicted, not merely accused, not merely arrested, but convicted in a court of law, of domestic abuse. He had been convicted of disorderly conduct. He had been convicted of driving while under the influence. Multiple convictions. Multiple separate incidents. Multiple occasions on which the legal system had the opportunity to look at this man's behavior and respond, and it did respond, and he kept moving.
That is why we partner with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're already a victim and protect yourself. Use promo code Nancy at HometitleLock.com to get a free title history report, plus a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 of fraud. They'll spend up to $1 million to fix it. Don't be a victim. Protect your home equity today. That's HometitleLock.com, promo code Nancy, or just use the link below.
There is a pattern of escalating behavior.
Our
a track record of smaller violations that accumulate over time, each one a warning
Maxwell
sign, each one a point on a trajectory that the system had the opportunity to redirect and did not redirect forcefully enough to change where it was heading.
He was arrested.
Anderson's convictions for domestic abuse and disorderly conduct were those warning signs.
A search warrant
was blood evidence.
They were documented and publicly accessible.
This guy,
and the young woman who would become the center of this investigation in April of 2024 had no way of knowing they existed.
33-year-old former high school football star.
A close friend of Anderson's,
he's a Nepo
someone
baby.
who had known him well for some time, who had been inside his home on at least one occasion,
guy,
would later
Maxwell
tell investigators
Anderson,
something that
has
is deeply difficult to process,
dad
even
who
now,
ran a
long after the
Milwaukee
fact.
insurance brokerage
During a visit to
firm.
Anderson's home in the year before these events,
what do we know
this friend
about
had noticed
him,
something in the backyard.
Alexis Tereszchuk?
A large hole. It was approximately 5 feet long by 6 feet deep.
He has been arrested for domestic abuse,
precise in its dimensions.
For disorderly conduct and
when
for
the friend
drunk
asked
driving.
about it,
This
Anderson
guy
offered
has
an explanation.
He
He said he was working on an additional underground
He is not an outstanding citizen
basement.
of the community, and as
He
I said,
already
these are
had a
not just
large
arrests.
basement in the home.
We're waiting to hear from. He has been
He was,
convicted of
apparently,
all three.
building another one beneath
this guy.
5 feet
Police
long,
find
6 feet deep.
a foot.
For anyone who has not immediately done the mental geometry, those are the dimensions of a human grave.
Up. In
a friend
the
saw that hole,
they find
heard that
blood,
explanation, and
gasoline
moved on.
containers.
Because what else do you do when someone you know, someone you have watched football with, someone you have had drinks with, someone whose family you are familiar with, offers an explanation that is strange
Let me
but
tell
not
you this,
impossible?
and I'm going to go to you, Faddis,
You
with
accept
me,
it.
high-profile trial
You give
lawyer,
the benefit
TV
of the
legal
doubt.
analyst, founding
You tell
partner
yourself
of the
that
Warner
people have all
Faddis
kinds
Elite
of home
Legal
improvement
Group.
projects,
Eric,
and that a second underground
this
basement,
isn't his
while
first
unusual,
time.
is not a crime.
0
You file it away
to
as one of the more
120
eccentric things you have ever heard,
MPH
and you go on with
in
your
2
life.
seconds. There has
And
to
Maxwell
be
Anderson
something,
continued his
some
preparations.
revving up to,
We need to talk
not
about
only
the
a
basement.
murder, but a
Because
luring,
what investigators found in the basement of Maxwell Anderson's West Milwaukee home is central to this case in a way that nothing else quite is.
Have a drink, have dinner,
It is central to understanding the nature of what Shadeai Robinson walked into on the night of April 1st, 2024, and it is central to understanding the scope and the duration of the planning that preceded that night. When police executed their search warrant at Anderson's home on Wednesday, April the 4th, just 48 hours after the leg was found at Warnemont Park, what they found in that basement would be described in official police communications and in reporting by multiple accredited news outlets as a sex dungeon. That phrase is clinical. It strips some of the horror out of what was actually there. So let
a
us
neighbor's
be more
security
specific,
camera shows
because
two
the
figures
specific
entering
details are what
Anderson's
allow us to
backyard at
understand the
9:24 p.m.
premeditation, the
At
calculation,
12:47
the
a.m.,
deliberate
a
and
street
sustained
camera
effort
shows
over time that
Robinson's
went
car
into creating
departing
this space.
Anderson's home.
The
A
basement
camera
was
at
described as
Cudahy High
unfinished
School
but
shows a
modified,
car drive
modified
toward the
in
pump
ways that
house
had
at
absolutely
Warnemont
nothing to
Park
do
at
with
2:53
ordinary home
a.m.
renovation.
A figure is seen
Inside,
walking from the road and
investigators found
climbing
a sex
down the
sling.
bluff to the
They
beach
found
several
restraints.
times. At 4:31 a.m., the
handcuffs.
car leaves the park.
They found
3
multiple
hours
tools
later,
stored in
bus
this space,
surveillance catches a
including a
man
hacksaw,
carrying a
a
tan
circular saw,
backpack
and a
walking
power
away
drill.
from a fire at
The
30th
mattress
and
of a
Lisbon.
queen-size bed had
At
been flipped up on
8:12
its
a.m.,
side.
Anderson, carrying
Bedding
a
was
tan
tossed across a
backpack,
table
is
in
seen
one
boarding
corner.
a bus heading toward
Tables,
his home.
chairs, and
Anderson
various
gets
pieces
off
of
at
exercise
8:35
equipment were present
a.m. and
throughout the
enters
cluttered
his
space.
backyard 8
The windows
minutes
of the basement,
later.
the windows
Bro,
that might,
you
in
haven't
other
even been
circumstances,
able to
have
have
been
a
visible from the
funeral
street or from
yet.
neighboring
Why?
properties, had always been covered.
Yes, that's correct, Nancy.
Neighbors confirmed that they had never been able to
This
see
is
inside.
probably the hardest part
Those
that we're
windows were
struggling
always
with
dark,
right now.
always
Trying
blocked.
to find peace, laying my daughter
From the
to
outside
rest.
of that house, there was nothing whatsoever to indicate what was happening in the space
They
beneath it.
they can't even provide us
Inside
with
the
a death
basement floor,
certificate right now.
investigators found something else.
They don't even know the
A large
cause of
hole
my
had been
daughter's
deliberately
death.
dug into the concrete.
They don't know when.
Not a pre-existing
Like, they
drain,
not
not a
giving me an
standard
update.
structural feature, not anything
There
that
is
belonged
no
to the original
closure right
construction
now
of
for
the
me and my
house.
family.
A hole that
T.
had been
Grace here.
purposefully
Please
and
join
manually
us on
opened in the
Crime
floor.
Stories and stream it first
drain in
on
the floor
Fox
had been
1.
stuffed with
When breaking
towels.
crime news develops,
Evidence
we
markers were
investigate it
placed
and bring
throughout the
it to
area as
you.
forensic teams
Bombshell
documented what they
updates,
were finding
answers
in real
to
time.
unanswered questions from
And then there
cases
was a door.
making the headlines
A door
and
without a
cases
handle
you
leading to
may
a dark
never
closet.
have heard of. Until
Law
Crime
enforcement
Stories,
sources would later
we go
confirm that
inside
Anderson had not only
investigations
been
with
modifying
exclusive
this basement
interviews,
space,
crime
but had also
victims,
been in the
families
process of digging a
seeking
second underground
justice,
layer beneath it,
investigators,
as if the
experts,
existing
and sources
underground
from
chamber,
within
with
the
everything it
case
already
itself.
contained,
Stream it
was
first
somehow
on Fox
insufficient for
1.
whatever purposes he
I
had
hope to
in
see you
mind.
there, and
He was
thank you,
building
friend.
downward.
Remains a fourth set
Building
of
deeper.
body parts, this time
Building
at
what
a remote
amounted to a
tree-lined stretch
subterranean
of beach
infrastructure
along
of
South
confinement
Michigan.
and harm,
Just
layer
after
by
7
layer,
a.m.,
in
someone
a
walking
residential
along a
home in
South
West
Milwaukee
Milwaukee
water
while
line
his neighbors
discovered
went about
an
their
arm
ordinary
and
lives on
torso.
either side of
The
him.
remains washed
And
ashore
then
about
there
a
was the
quarter of a
blood.
mile from a nearby apartment
Investigators
complex.
found blood stains on a comforter.
This is the fourth
They found
set
blood on the
of
wall of the
remains.
stairwell
This
leading
time,
down from the
a
upper level of the
torso.
home to
What
the basement
else
below.
is missing?
Blood
to
that had
Aaron
traveled up the
Maben,
wall in a way that
investigative reporter
suggested
and
significant
anchor for
force.
Fox 6 in
The
Milwaukee.
kind of force that leaves
Aaron,
physical
thank you for
evidence
being
on
with us.
vertical
There's
surfaces.
so much happening and so
The kind
quick.
of
First,
force
I want
that
to
tells
go
its own
to
story about what happened
the
in that
torso.
stairwell, in that space,
We have
before
a
the forensic
torso,
teams
a
ever
female
arrived.
torso.
Here
that
is the
has
detail that makes
washed
this
up,
case even
so to
more
speak.
alarming than it
We
already
have
is.
Maben.
When
This is
investigators
blood
tested
on
that blood,
bedding
when they ran it against the
going
DNA of
up
Shadeai Robinson
the
and
wall
against a sample from
the
Anderson
basement,
himself,
and we
neither
know
was a match.
that the basement,
The blood
now
on those walls,
uncovered
on that bedding,
dungeon,
in that stairwell,
and blood
did not
elsewhere
belong to
in the home,
Shadeai
blood
Robinson.
where it shouldn't be.
It did not belong
in the
to Maxwell
normal
Anderson.
course of one's routine.
It belonged to someone
So,
else entirely.
With all of this happening,
Someone
I can't
whose
help
identity,
but wonder,
as of the time
are
investigators
there
were speaking
more
publicly
victims?
about
Since
this
that blood
case,
does not
remained
match
unknown.
Shadeai, and
Which
we have
raised the
reason to
question that law
believe
enforcement
it doesn't
itself was
match
asking out
the
loud in the
defendant,
weeks following
the
the
suspect.
arrest.
But back
Were
to
there
the
other
torso.
victims?
Tell me everything.
If Anderson had been
this
using this
all
basement for
began
the
with
purposes
a
its
severed
contents so
leg
clearly
at a parking
suggest,
cut-hay.
if this was a space
And
he had
it just sparked
constructed
so
and
much
equipped
mystery,
deliberately
and that's what this
over
case has
time,
been,
with
Nancy.
specific and terrible
A ton
intentions,
of mystery.
then
Where
Shadeai
are
Robinson
these
may
body
not have
parts
been the
first
first
off
person
coming
brought
from?
into that room.
And then we later learned that
That
in
is
a
not a
missing
comfortable
girl,
thing to sit with.
the latest was that
But it is
arm
an
and
honest
torso
account of what the evidence
that
was
washed
telling
up on
investigators,
shore. Someone
and it
was
matters,
walking along
and
the
it has
beach,
to be said.
Nancy, and they found
The
this
basement of
arm
Maxwell
and torso.
Anderson's home was
Now
not
let's go back
thrown
to that
together
severed leg, because
spontaneously.
these places where they were
It was
found
not assembled in
really
a
not
night or a
close to each
frantic
other.
weekend
They're
of
a few
preparation.
miles away, about
The
a 10-minute
modifications to
drive
that
from each
space,
other.
the covered
And
windows,
police were
the
quickly
restraints,
able to
the
identify
tools, the
this
hole in
arm
the
and
floor,
torso
the drain
were
stuffed
that of
with
Shadeai
towels,
Robinson.
the secondary
There's a
underground
very
chamber
strong
being constructed
possibility
beneath it,
that there are
represented
other
hours,
victims.
days,
And you know where I'm
perhaps
going with
weeks
this,
of
Aaron
deliberate and
Maben?
calculated
If
work.
you- Has he
Someone
put
had thought through what
other
this
victims,
space needed to be and had worked
specifically,
methodically
who
and
was that
patiently to
grave
make it
dug
that
for
way.
in his back?
That
Who else
person
had
was,
been in that
investigators
sex
believe, Maxwell
chamber
Anderson.
that he had in his basement?
And somewhere
Part
along
of
the way,
Sade in
as
the
he built
water,
and equipped and covered his windows and
ergo,
dug his holes,
has he put
had
other
identified a
victims in the
target.
water? See where I'm going
Investigators were
We know that
determined
right
to
now police
understand
are just
exactly
searching
how
for
Shadeai
Shadeai
Robinson
Get a
came to
free
be on a date
title
with
history
Maxwell
report
Anderson on the
plus
night of
a
April
free
1st,
trial of their
2024.
$1 million
The full
promo
answer to
code
that question was
Nancy,
still,
or
in some
just
respects,
use the link
developing
below.
in the weeks after
And
Anderson's arrest.
Person
luck.
of interest.
But what investigators
Maxwell
uncovered in
Stephen
those early weeks
Anderson,
painted a
who
deeply
lives
troubling
in the
picture of a
3100
man who
block
was not
of
simply
South
operating on
39th
impulse.
Street, where
A man who had
he
been
was
positioning
arrested
himself carefully,
after a
methodically,
traffic
and
stop
deliberately for a very
near
long
the
time.
home.
The
A
first
search-
thread investigators
This
followed was
guy-
Victor's nightclub.
This idiot
Anderson had, at some
left
point in his
a
bartending
phone
career,
trail
worked at
a
Victor's,
mile
a
wide.
club
You
in the
know, when
Milwaukee
you
area
look
that
at his
investigators
home,
would
you think,
later learn was
wow,
a venue that Shadeai
beautiful
Robinson and her
yard, and
co-workers from
immaculately
Pizza Shovel
kept. You know
occasionally
why?
visited together.
Not because of him.
Among the search warrants unsealed in the
33-year-old
weeks following
former
Anderson's
high
arrest
school
were
football
requests to
star.
review employment
He's a
records and
nepo
surveillance
baby.
footage from victors.
Nepotism baby.
The implication
This
was unmistakable.
33-year-old
Investigators
guy,
wanted to know
Maxwell
whether
Anderson,
Anderson had
has a
encountered Shadeai
millionaire
Robinson at Victor's
dad
before
who
their
ran
date.
a Milwaukee
Whether he had
insurance
seen her there,
brokerage firm.
possibly more than once,
Now,
possibly
what
over
do
a
we
span
know
of weeks or
about
months,
him,
and had been watching
Alexis Tereszchuk?
her, evaluating her. selecting her.
He has a rap
The
sheet.
second
He has
thread
been
was
arrested
dating
for
applications.
drunk driving. This guy
As
has
investigators
a rap
dug
sheet a
deeper
mile
into the
long.
circumstances
He is
surrounding
not
that
an
Monday
upstanding
night,
citizen of the
they began
community. And
focusing
as I
on the
said, these are
strong
not just
possibility
arrests.
that Anderson
We're
and
waiting to hear
Shadeai
from he
had
has been
connected through a
convicted
digital
of
dating
This guy.
platform.
Police
In the days and weeks
find
following the arrest, law enforcement was
afoot
actively reviewing Anderson's
in
activity
the
across
home,
multiple digital
they find
platforms,
blood,
trying to reconstruct the full timeline of how
gasoline
their connection was
containers,
established and what was said.
packages addressed to the
Had he
defendant,
reached out
very
to her through an app?
important.
Had he
Blood
crafted a
on
profile
a
designed to
comforter,
present himself
blood
as something he
scattered
was
throughout
not,
the home.
settled, stable,
Let me tell
socially
you this,
rooted,
and I'm going to go to
safe?
you, Faddis, with me,
Had he said
high-profile
something
trial
specific,
lawyer,
offered
TV
something
legal
appealing,
analyst,
that made a
founding partner
19-year-old
of
woman
the Warner
comfortable
family.
enough to accept a dinner
This
invitation
isn't
from a
his
man her
first
family had
20
never heard of?
MPH
Shadai's mother
in 2
confirmed
seconds.
that she had
There
never heard
has
her
to
daughter
be
mention Maxwell
something,
Anderson by
some
name at any
revving
point.
up to
He was
not
not
only
someone
a
Shadeai
murder,
had spoken
but
about
a
to her
luring
He was
her
not someone her
onto a
parents
date
had met
that
or been
before he
introduced to
gets
in
the
any
guts up to
context.
say, hey, would you like to go to
He
dinner?
was a stranger who
He
had somehow,
planned this.
through whatever
Nancy, it's
combination of
chilling
digital
to think about
presentation and
what was going
strategic
through Maxwell
communication and
Anderson's
carefully
mind
constructed
allegedly
impression,
as he
cleared the
appears
bar
to
of
have
appearing
been
trustworthy
preparing
enough
for
for a
this.
first date.
The details
The
give rise
maintenance
to
worker
a
at Shadai's
predatory
apartment
nature
building
here.
would later
There's a
recall that on the
deep
evening of
hole
April
dug
1st,
in his
Shadeai
backyard.
had stopped to
And then we
speak
look
with
at
him
the
before
rapidity,
leaving for the night.
how quickly
She was excited, he
this
said.
turned from a murder
She told
to
him she was heading out on her first date with a man named
overnight.
Maxwell
A
Anderson,
neighbor's security
33
camera
years
shows
old.
two figures entering
She
Anderson's
seemed happy,
backyard at 9:24 p.m.
animated.
At 12:47
Looking
a.m.,
forward
a
to the
street
evening
camera
ahead
shows
with the kind of
Robinson's car
uncomplicated
departing
anticipation
Anderson's
that
home.
belongs to someone who
A
has no
camera
reason
at
to be
Cudahy
afraid.
High School shows a
She
car
left her
drive
building
toward
that
the
night
pump
with pink
house
nail
at
polish on her
Warnemont Park
toes
at
and a dinner
2:53
reservation
a.m.
at a seafood
A
restaurant
figure
and
is
the
seen
ordinary
walking from
optimism
the
of a
road
young
and
woman
climbing
heading out
down the
into a
bluff
Monday evening.
to the beach several
She had
times.
no reason to
At
believe she was in
4:31
danger.
a.m., the car leaves the
She
park.
had no reason to
3
believe
hours
that the
later,
man she
bus
was meeting had been
surveillance
planning
catches a
this for
man
longer than
carrying
she
a
had known
tan
he existed.
backpack walking away from
She
a
had no
fire
way of
at
knowing what
30th
was in
and
that
Lisbon.
basement.
At
She had
8:12
no way of
a.m.,
knowing about the
Anderson,
hole in the
carrying a
backyard
tan
or the tools on
backpack,
the
is seen
shelves or
boarding
the
a
windows
bus
that
heading
neighbors had
toward
never
his
been able
home.
to see through.
Anderson gets off at
Carlos
8:35 a.m.
Shadai's
and
father,
enters his
would later say that when
backyard.
he heard about the
Death
nature of this date,
certificate right now.
when he heard that his daughter
Look,
had agreed to
they
dinner
don't
with
even
someone
know
she
the
had
cause of
apparently
my
just met
car's
through some
death.
digital platform, it
I
did
don't
not
know
sit right with
when.
him.
Like,
He
they
said
not giving
directly
me
and
enough
plainly that
information.
Anderson was
There is
not
no
Shadai's type.
closure right now for me and
That
my
he could
stream
not
it
picture
first
his
on
daughter
Fox
agreeing to
1.
go to a
When
stranger's
breaking
home
crime
after a
news
first
develops,
date,
we
especially
investigate
someone
it
she
and
had
bring
no
it
prior
to you.
connection to.
Bombshell
That
updates,
something about the whole
answers
picture
to
did not
unanswered
fit.
questions from cases
He was right to
making the
feel that way.
headlines and
Because
cases
the picture
you
had been
may
carefully
never
constructed
have
for
heard of
maximum
until Crime
plausibility.
Stories. We
Anderson
go
chose a
inside
restaurant he was
investigations
personally
with
familiar
exclusive
with,
interviews,
the Twisted
crime
Fisherman,
victims,
where he had
families
previously worked,
seeking
where he knew
justice,
the staff, where
investigators,
his presence
experts,
would seem
and sources
entirely
from
natural and
within the
comfortable
case
and
itself.
A
unremarkable.
fourth set of body
He brought her
parts,
somewhere
this time
safe
at a
looking.
remote tree-lined
He
stretch of
gave the
beach along
appearance of a
South
man
Michigan.
who was rooted and
Just after
socially
7 a.m.,
established and
someone
not a threat
walking
to
along a
anyone.
South Milwaukee waterline
had thought through
discovered
how to
an
appear.
arm and torso.
He had
The
practiced the
remains washed
presentation.
ashore about a quarter of a
He did
mile
not
from a
bring her
nearby
somewhere
apartment
unfamiliar.
complex.
He brought her somewhere
This is
that
the
felt,
fourth
from the
set
outside,
of
like a perfectly
remains this
ordinary
time.
first date.
A torso.
He had
what
thought this
else
through.
is missing?
Now
to
let us
Aaron
walk through the
Maben,
evening of April
investigative
1st,
reporter and anchor for
2024.
Fox 6 in Milwaukee.
Because the timeline of that
Aaron,
night is
thank you for
documented
being
in
with us.
remarkable detail,
We have a
captured on
torso,
surveillance
a
cameras at
female
multiple
torso
locations across
that
Milwaukee's
has
east side
washed
and
up,
well beyond.
so to speak. We
The
have
cameras saw what no
blood
human being
on
in Shadeai
bedding
Robinson's life was able
going
to see in
up
time.
the wall
And in the
from
days and
the
weeks that
basement,
followed,
and
that
we
footage
know
would become one
that
of the
the
most critical
basement,
pieces of
now
evidence in the
uncovered,
entire investigation.
and blood elsewhere in the home,
Shadeai
blood
Robinson
where it
and Maxwell
shouldn't
Anderson
be
arrived at
in
the
the
Twisted
normal
Fisherman separately
course of
that
one's
evening.
routine. So,
Surveillance footage
with
from
all
outside
of
the
this
restaurant
happening, I
shows
can't
her
help
approaching
but
from one
wonder,
direction,
are
Anderson from
there
another.
more victims? Since
They
that
came
blood does
together
not
inside.
match Sade,
The bartender
and
working
we have
that
reason
night,
to believe
someone who knew
it
Anderson
doesn't
from his
match
time working
the
at the same
defendant,
establishment,
the suspect.
would
But
later
back
tell
to the torso.
investigators that
Tell
the
me
two sat
everything.
together at the bar.
Well, you know, this all
They
began
seemed
with a
relaxed,
severed leg
friendly,
at a park in Cudahy.
comfortable in
And
each
it
other's
just
company,
sparked so much
at least from
mystery.
the
And that's what
outside
this
looking
case has
in.
been, Nancy.
There was
A
nothing
ton
in their
of
visible
mystery.
demeanor
Where
that night
are
that would
these
have
body
alarmed
parts
anyone
first
watching.
off coming from?
No
And then we
raised
later,
voices, no
the
visible
latest was
tension,
that arm
no
and
sign of
torso
anything other than two
that
people out for
washed
a
up
drink on a
on
Monday
shore.
evening.
Someone was walking along the
They
beach,
stayed at the
Nancy,
Twisted
and they
Fisherman for
found
less
this
than an
arm
hour.
and torso.
Then they
Now let's
moved
go
on
back to that
together.
severed leg, because these
Their next
places
stop
where they
was
were
a bar
found
called
really
Dukes on
not
Water.
close to each other. They're a few
Again,
miles away,
surveillance footage
about a
placed them both
10-minute
at the
drive from each
location.
other. And
They were
police
together.
were quickly able to
They were there
identify
for a
that this
period of
arm and
time,
torso
continuing
were
what
that of
looked
Shadeai
to every
Robinson.
camera that recorded
There's a
them
very
like a
strong
perfectly ordinary
possibility
evening
that there
out.
are other victims.
By
And you
approximately
know where I'm
9
going with
o'clock
this,
in the
Aaron
evening,
Maben?
the two of them
Other
left
victims.
Dukes on water together.
Specifically, who was
9
that
o'clock
grave
on a
sex
Monday night in early
chamber
April.
that he had in his
A
basement?
neighbor's
Water?
security camera, one of those
Ergo,
ordinary
has
residential
he put
surveillance
other
systems
victims
that people
in the water?
install to
See
keep
where
an
I'm
eye on
going
their
with
front
this?
porch.
We know
their
that right now
driveway,
police are just
the occasional
swabbed
raccoon
a
going
wall
through
in
their
the
garbage,
basement.
picked up
We
something
know that
significant
that
at
blood
9:24 that
was
evening.
not Shadeai
Two figures
Robinson's
entering the
DNA.
backyard of Maxwell
Speaking
Anderson's
of
home on South
searching the
39th
home,
Street.
listen to this.
Two figures.
Maxwell Anderson
Going
had
in.
a sex dungeon in the
At
basement of his
12:47 in
West
the morning,
Milwaukee home,
nearly 4
according to a
hours
law
after those
enforcement
two figures were
source.
seen
Cops
entering that
found a
backyard,
sex
the
sling,
street camera
restraints,
captured
and
something.
handcuffs. A close
Shadeai
friend of
Robinson's
Anderson said
car
that on
was
a
seen
visit to
departing from the
Anderson's
area
home
of
last year,
Anderson's
he
home on
noticed a
South
large hole
39th
in the ground
Street.
that was about 5 feet long
Anderson
by
was
6 foot
driving
deep. Anderson said
She
he
was
was
not
working on an
inside.
underground basement, despite
A
having a
camera
large
positioned
basement
near
in the
Cudahy
home
High
already.
School, in the
Neighbors say the
vicinity of
basement in the
Warnemont
home
Park,
had small
recorded
windows that were
footage in the
always
early
covered,
hours
so
of
you could
Tuesday
not see
morning.
inside.
At 2:53
Joining
in the
us
morning,
right now,
a vehicle was seen
crimeonline.com
approaching
investigative
the pump
reporter
house
Sydney
area near the
Sumner
park,
found
the
in
same area
suspect's
where,
home. Just
less
ask
than
one
48
more
hours
time
later, a park
about
goer
the
would encounter a
blood,
severed
the
human
location
leg on
of
the
the
shoreline.
blood.
The footage shows
Nancy,
a
they
figure
found those
emerging from the
gas cans
vehicle,
and the blood
walking from the
stains on
roadway
that
down
search
toward the
warrant from
beach,
April
descending the
4th.
bluff toward the
Gas cans were
waterline, and
found
then
in the
returning to the
garage,
vehicle
and that
and
just
going
further
back down again.
corroborates that
Multiple
Anderson
trips,
is responsible for that car
back and
fire.
forth,
We remember he was
in the dark,
seen entering a
in the cold
bus
April air
just
off
after
Lake
the fire
Michigan,
started, carrying a
in the
tan
hours before
backpack
dawn.
matching multiple
The
witness
vehicle departed
descriptions.
Warnemont Park
And
at
that blood
4:31 in
again
the
was
morning.
found on bedding,
3
on a
hours after
comforter,
leaving the park,
and on
bus
the
surveillance
What
cameras
is that?
captured a
Say
different
to
scene.
later? What's
At
that?
7:31 in the morning, a man was
Exactly what
reported
a
walking
person's
away from a
intention
burning
was.
car
It's
at
a 5
30th
feet
and
by
Lisbon,
6 feet
a
grave.
fire
It's
that
a
would
human
later be
body
established
size.
as a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence.
Fences stacking up
He was
fast.
carrying a tan
For many,
backpack.
the only option
face
is
and
caught
his
in a
build were
cycle of
captured on the bus
high-interest
camera.
debt.
At
But go
8:12
to
in the
American
morning,
Finances.
Maxwell
Talk to
Anderson
them.
boarded a
Work
bus
for
heading in the
you.
direction of his
Imagine
home.
rolling that
He was
high-interest
carrying a
debt
tan backpack.
into one very
same
manageable
backpack.
monthly payment.
At
No
8:35, he
upfront
got off the
fees,
bus.
zero
8
pressure
minutes later,
from
he was seen entering his
salary-based
own
consultants.
backyard.
Why is that
The
important?
surveillance trail
Because they're
assembled
not
by
on a contingency
investigators was
fee.
not a
They're
single
not
moment of bad luck for
salespeople that are going to
Maxwell
get a
Anderson.
cut if
It was a
they sell
comprehensive,
you
multi-point
their
timeline that
services.
placed him
On
at or
average,
near every
their customers
location
are
connected
saving
to this
$800
case, in
a
sequence,
month,
across
not
a
$800
continuous
in
span of
all,
approximately 12
$800 a
hours.
month. Start
From
today,
the restaurant
and
to
you
the bar
might be
to his
able
home
to
to the
delay
park to the
2
burning car to the
mortgage
bus to his
payments.
backyard.
American Financing,
The cameras had
America's
caught all of
home
it.
for home loans.
Every stop,
866-888-0344.
every movement across the city on the longest night of Shadeai Robinson's life, recorded and time-stamped and
Or
preserved.
simply go online to
The city had been watching that night,
AmericanFinancing.net
and it had seen
Nancy.
everything. At the center of all of it, a
AmericanFinancing.net
19-year-old girl who had gone out for seafood on a
and
Monday
dug in
evening
the
and never
concrete
came
floor.
home.
A drain in the floor
We
is
have
stuffed
to
with
talk
towels.
about what
The
was
drain
found in the
cover
days
marked
that
with
followed.
evidence numbers. A
I
door
want to
without a
handle this
handle
with the
leads to a
respect it
dark
deserves,
closet, and there are
because we are
several
talking
tables,
about
a
a
chair,
human
and
being,
exercise
about
equipment.
someone's
The
daughter,
mattress of a
someone's
queen bed
granddaughter,
frame is flipped
someone's
on
life.
its side, and bedding
But
is
the
tossed over
discoveries
a table in the
themselves
corner
and
of
the
the room.
details surrounding them are part of the public record, and they
You
are
are
part of what tells the complete story of
that
what
we have managed
Shadeai
to
Robinson
obtain
endured and what
of
Maxwell
the
Anderson allegedly did in the
underground
hours after those cameras last recorded her
chamber, as it
alive.
has been described.
The first
But
discovery
there
came
is
on the
more.
afternoon of April the 2nd,
More than what you're
2024.
seeing.
A park goer
From
at
a
Warnemont Park, a
hacksaw
well-loved
to a
recreation
circular
area
saw
along the
to a
southwestern
power
shores
drill,
of Lake Michigan in the
a
Cudahy
grave
area, approximately
dug in
5
the
miles southeast of
backyard,
downtown Milwaukee,
various
was
sex
out in the park in the late
paraphernalia,
afternoon when they encountered
all
something that had no
found
place in
in
any
this
ordinary Tuesday
underground
afternoon.
bunker belonging
Something
to
that
the
required
son
a phone
of a
call to
Milwaukee
police that the person who
millionaire.
made it will
We
not
also
forget for the
learned
rest of their
that
life.
he was in fact
A
digging
severed human leg.
another
Police were
underground
called at approximately
lair.
5:30 in the evening.
What, if anything,
Officers
that
responded and
Sade
secured the scene.
had been killed.
Forensic teams followed.
The
leg, it was noted with careful documentation, had pink nail polish on the toes. That detail, the pink nail polish, would become a thread that investigators would pull on carefully and deliberately in the days that followed.
She was still
It would
here.
connect what initially appeared to be unrelated discoveries spread across a wide geographical area into a single, coherent,
That's what I
devastating
was
picture.
praying for.
And it would ultimately become a piece of evidence that forensic experts described as powerfully confirmatory even before DNA results came back from the laboratory.
Discovered, as it's being
3 days after the discovery at Warnemont Park, on April the 5th, a second call came in to Milwaukee police. This time from a location approximately 11 miles away from the lake, on Milwaukee's west side. Human remains had been found at a playground. A playground. A place where children play, where parents push strollers across the pavement, where toddlers learn to navigate the world at the pace of small feet on familiar ground. Human remains were found in that space and left there, discarded as if they were nothing, as if the person they had once belonged to was nothing and deserved nothing and left nothing behind. Within 24 hours of the playground discovery, police were responding to yet another scene. A car had been found on fire, a fire that surveillance footage would shortly connect directly to Anderson, and near that fire, in the same general vicinity, investigators found additional human remains. Alongside those remains, they found something else. A distinctive blanket. A pet tribute blanket, soft and personal, covered in images of animals. The kind of blanket that someone keeps because it means something to them. The kind of object that is entirely private and specific and not easily mistaken for anyone else's. Shadeai Robinson's family recognized it immediately. The fourth set of remains came from yet another location, this one very different in character from the others. Someone walking along the waterline in South Milwaukee, just after 7 o'clock in the morning, found an arm and a torso that had washed ashore from the lake. The remains were discovered approximately a quarter of a mile from a nearby residential apartment complex, along a stretch of Lake Michigan's southwestern shoreline that people use for morning walks. Police were called. Investigators responded. Forensic teams processed the scene quickly. They were able to confirm, with relative speed, that these remains also belonged to Shadeai Robinson. For locations. For sets of remains. Spread across the greater Milwaukee area, some near the lake, some miles inland, some along shorelines, some near railroad tracks, one at a children's playground. The geography of those discoveries told its own grim story about the deliberate and systematic effort that had been made to disperse what had been left of a 19-year-old girl. To scatter her across the city. To make identification as difficult and as slow as possible. To erase her. On Saturday, April the 6th, law enforcement continued their search of the areas surrounding the previous discoveries, and along the railroad tracks, investigators located additional human remains. Later that same evening, after Shadeai's family located the pet tribute blanket in a park area, detectives returned to search in proximity to that location, and they found more. According to court documents, the remains found that Saturday included human flesh and a foot. The foot had pink nail polish. The nail polish appeared to match the polish on the leg that had been found at Warnemont Park 4 days earlier. Forensics professor Joseph Scott Morgan of Jacksonville State University spoke publicly about the significance of that detail. He explained that while DNA confirmation would follow and would be definitive, the matching nail polish was a powerful and immediate connector. He spoke about the principle of trace evidence, the principle that every contact between two things leaves a trace of that contact behind. He noted that in this case, the trace evidence would run in a specific and important direction. Shadeai's DNA, her physical presence, her touch, would be found on Anderson. Not only the reverse. The evidence would point both ways. And one of its most powerful arrows would be the molecular signature of the young woman herself, recovered from the person who had tried to erase her. He said, with quiet and deliberate gravity, that it could be Shadeai herself who ultimately brings Maxwell Anderson to justice. That thought is both devastating and, in some way that is difficult to articulate, meaningful. Because it means she is still present in this case. Still speaking. Still refusing, even now, to be entirely erased. Carlos Robinson, Shadeai's father, spoke about the ongoing search with a raw and unfiltered anguish that is deeply difficult to hear and impossible to forget once you have heard it. He spoke about going out through the night, not sleeping, not resting, not stopping, with a flashlight and binoculars, searching parks and shorelines himself, moving through the dark hours of early April in Milwaukee trying to find pieces of his daughter so that he could put her to rest properly. He spoke about having dreams. He spoke about not being able to stop. He spoke about police telling him they had already searched a particular area, and then volunteers and family members going to that same area and finding things that the police had missed. He said, simply and devastatingly, "I just want to find her. I can't sleep. I just want her to at least rest in peace. I can't do that until I have her together." At the time he gave those words publicly, 2 parts of Shadeai Robinson's body had not been recovered. Her head. And one of her arms. Her father was still looking. If you are still with us right now, if this story is hitting you the way it is hitting the people who have been following it since April, leave a comment below and tell us what you are feeling. Tell us her name. Say it out loud. That is what she deserves. And while you are there, make sure you are subscribed to The Missing Truth so that you never miss an episode. Because we are not going anywhere, and neither is this story, and neither is our commitment to telling it until everyone who should hear it has heard it. Investigators moved quickly once the discoveries began. Given the nature of the evidence, given the surveillance footage that was already accumulating across multiple cameras at multiple locations across the city, given the timeline that was emerging with chilling clarity and internal consistency, the decision to focus on Maxwell Stephen Anderson as the primary person of interest came within days of the leg being found at Warnemont Park. On Wednesday, April 4, 2024, just 48 hours after that first discovery, police arrested Anderson during a traffic stop near his home in the 3100 block of South 39th Street. The stop was not coincidental. Investigators had been watching. They had been building. They had enough, in that moment, to pull him over and take him into custody. A search warrant was simultaneously executed at Anderson's home. What investigators found inside that home was comprehensive, damning, and deeply disturbing in ways that extended well beyond anything that could be attributed to the events of a single night. Blood evidence, on a comforter, on the wall of the stairwell leading down to the basement, positioned and distributed in a way that told its own story about the violence that had occurred in that space. Gas cans in the garage, consistent with the car fire at 30th and Lisbon that surveillance footage had already placed Anderson at. Packages addressed to Anderson, recovered from the premises and entered into evidence. The basement and everything it contained. All of it, photographed and documented and logged and preserved. And then the phone. Maxwell Anderson had left what investigators and legal analysts described, without exaggeration, as a phone trail a mile wide. Smartphones track and store and transmit an almost unimaginable amount of information about their users, location data, communication records, timestamps, application activity, and Anderson apparently did not fully account for how thoroughly his own device had been documenting his movements and his communications in the hours before and after Shadeai's disappearance. Text messages between Anderson and Shadeai were recovered, showing their exchange about where to eat that night, her telling him she was feeling like seafood, the logistics of the evening they were planning together. Digital records of their earlier communication established the existence and the character of the relationship, established the plan. Location data placed his device at the relevant locations in the relevant sequence. Timestamps filled in the gaps. The phone, quite literally, spoke. And what it said was damning. Investigators also obtained records of Anderson's activity across various digital platforms as they worked to establish a complete picture of the days and weeks leading up to April 1. 8 search warrants were ultimately unsealed in the weeks following the arrest, each one revealing another layer of the investigation. Those warrants revealed that police were reviewing surveillance footage and employment records from Victor's nightclub. They were reviewing Anderson's digital presence across multiple platforms. They were reconstructing, as thoroughly as possible, the full history of how this man had operated, and for how long, and whether Shadeai Robinson was the only person he had ever brought into that basement. On Wednesday, April 4, Milwaukee Police Chief Jeffrey Norman announced the arrest publicly. Maxwell Stephen Anderson was charged in connection with the murder of Shadeai Robinson. He was held without bond. His defense attorney, in the days that followed, made a request that prompted outrage throughout the community and among Shadeai's family, a request that Anderson be provided with a personal laptop while in custody. That request was not well received by a public that had been watching a father search Lockshores in the dark of night with a flashlight, looking for pieces of his daughter. Anderson was 33 years old. He had the financial resources of a wealthy family behind him. He had a defense attorney. He had been given more chances and more cushions and more protection from full consequence over the course of his life than Shadeai Robinson ever received. She worked 2 jobs and paid every bill herself and earned every credential without asking anyone to carry anything for her. She was 1 month from her degree and dreaming of law school. And he had a lawyer asking for a laptop. There is a detail in this case that sits in the stomach and does not let go. A detail that emerged in the court documents and drew a collective response of disbelief and fury from everyone following the story. A confidential informant came forward. This individual, someone who had apparently been in contact with Maxwell Anderson, told investigators something that, if true, represents one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. According to this informant, Anderson had told him, in advance, before his date with Shadeai Robinson ever took place, before she ever left her apartment building that Monday evening, exactly what he was planning to do. He said he was going to lure her. He said he was going to take her to the basement. He said he was going to shoot her. He said he was going to dismember her. He told someone this. In advance. Someone knew. Someone heard those specific words come out of Maxwell Anderson's mouth and did not call the police, did not warn anyone, did not find a way to intervene before a 19-year-old girl got into a car and drove to a seafood restaurant to meet a man who had already described, in explicit and sequential detail, what he intended to do to her. We should note, because honesty requires it, that the nature of confidential informant testimony is legally complex. These systems handle CI information carefully, and there are important questions about when exactly this information was shared, under what circumstances, and what the informant's own legal situation was at the time. These are questions that will be addressed and examined rigorously in the legal proceedings. But the moral weight of that knowledge, the fact that someone heard this coming and said nothing in time to prevent it, is a thing that cannot be put down once you have picked it up. What this tells us about Maxwell Anderson, assuming this testimony is accurate, is perhaps the most important thing it is possible to say about him. This was not impulsive. This was not a night that got out of hand. This was not a moment of rage that exceeded the person's own intentions and surprised even them. This was premeditated. Planned. Announced in advance, with no apparent fear of consequence, to at least one other person. He told someone exactly what he was going to do. And then he did it. That is not a person who lost control. That is a person who had been in control, calculating, deliberate, thoroughly prepared, for a very long time. And this brings us back to the basement. To the hole in the backyard. To the covered windows and the stuffed drain and the hacksaw and the restraints and the sling and the secondary underground chamber being dug beneath the existing underground chamber. None of that was assembled in a night of sudden terrible impulse. It was assembled in anticipation. In preparation for exactly what Anderson apparently told the confidential informant he was planning to do. He had a target. He had a plan. He had a room. He had the tools. And someone had warned no one. I want to spend some time now talking about Sheena Scarrow. Because to cover this case responsibly, to do it the way it deserves to be done, means telling her story alongside her daughters. Shadeai Robinson did not exist in isolation. She was loved. Deeply, specifically, profoundly loved by a mother who built her life around the principle that you pour goodness into the world and goodness returns. Who raised her daughters to be givers, to be light workers, to be the kind of people who make every space they walk into better than they found it. And Sheena Scarrow has had to carry what happened in April of 2024 in her body and her mind and her bones every single day since. She has spoken publicly about her daughter, and about what it costs her to do so. She has described physical symptoms, an inability to sleep, an inability to eat, a way in which her own body began to reflect and absorb the violence that had been done to Shadeai, as if her empathy, the deep emotional attunement she had always had toward the people she loved, had turned inward and downward into a form of grief that her mind had not yet found language for but that her body understood completely. She said, "I can't describe it. But I don't move the same way physically. There are a lot of different layers of things going on with my physical health." She lost weight visibly in the weeks following the discoveries. Anyone watching her public appearances could see it. The body consuming itself in grief. And yet she kept showing up. She kept speaking. She kept saying her daughter's name out loud in public spaces because that was what Shadeai needed from her and she was not going to stop giving it. She spoke about receiving earrings in the mail. Shadeai had ordered a pair of earrings for herself before any of this happened. They arrived, as packages do, without knowing that the person they were meant for was already gone. Sheena opened them. She held them. And she put them on. "These are my baby's earrings," she said, holding them up, tears on her face. These came for her. There is no sentence in the English language that contains enough sorrow for that moment. A mother wearing the earrings her murdered daughter had ordered for herself. Keeping them close. Keeping something of Shadeai near her skin. Sheena Scarrow spoke with absolute clarity about what she wants from this case. She said she wants Maxwell Anderson and his family held fully accountable. She said her daughter was angelic and hurt nobody and did not deserve a single moment of what happened to her. And she said, they messed with the wrong family. Because we are not going to sit quiet and we are not going to sit still. She also said something that is bigger than this single case and deserves to be heard in its full context. She spoke about the reality that Shadeai Robinson is not the only young black woman who has gone missing in Milwaukee in recent years. She said there have been many black and brown girls who disappeared in that city, and that their cases have not always received the attention they deserved, the investigation they deserved, the voice they deserved. She said that in speaking for Shadeai, she is speaking for all of them. That she intends to call out every unresolved case. That she is not going to sit down or sit still until every one of those cases has been accounted for. That is a profound and courageous thing to say while simultaneously drowning in personal grief. Sheena Scarrow was not just fighting for her daughter in those moments. She was fighting for every daughter. She spoke about Shadeai's birthday, May the 10th. Mother's Day. She said, "I had her on Mother's Day. The child she gave birth to on the day the world celebrates mothers. The child who was taken a month before she turned 20. Before she graduated. Before she got to see what her own extraordinary life would become. This person took my daughter from me a month before she was graduating with her associate's degree. A month." We also need to talk about Carlos Robinson. Shadeai's father. The man who was out in the Milwaukee parks in the dark of early April nights with a flashlight and binoculars, searching for what was left of his daughter so that he could lay her to rest properly. Carlos Robinson confirmed the DNA match personally. He said that before that confirmation came back, while Shadeai was still officially classified as a missing person, he had held on to hope. He had prayed, he said, that the remains being found were not hers. That she was somewhere safe. That she would be found alive. He had allowed himself to believe in that possibility because what else do you do when you love someone that much and the alternative is something your mind is not built to fully hold? When the DNA came back, when the science confirmed what the heart had been fighting against with everything it had, the hope ended. And what replaced it was something no father should ever be asked to carry. He spoke about Shadeai's pet tribute blanket. About how volunteers, not official searchers, but private citizens who showed up because a family needed people to show up, had found that blanket in a park area that police had already told the family they had searched. He had gone to the police directly and asked them, "Why didn't you find it? If you searched that area, how did my daughter's blanket go unnoticed?" He did not receive an answer that satisfied him. And that question deserves an answer. Not as an accusation but as a genuine and urgent inquiry into how these searches are conducted, what the standards are, and whether those standards are being consistently applied. He spoke about her dreams. Her goal of becoming a lawyer. Her interest in the Air Force. The way she would call him and tell him what she was working toward, what she was planning, what was next on the road she had laid out for herself. He described her as independent-minded, someone who made her own decisions and kept him informed but did not need anyone to make choices for her. He said, she did everything right. He was asked what went through his mind when he heard about the basement. About the hole in the backyard and the saws and the restraints and the blood that did not belong to Shadeai on the walls of a stairwell leading down into a space that had been constructed for the purpose of harming someone. He said, it takes a different kind of evil to do something like this. He is right. And yet that evil existed. It existed in that house on South 39th Street. It had been building and preparing itself for an unknown length of time. And a girl who had done everything right walked into it on a Monday night in April because she trusted that the world was what it appeared to be. That the man she was meeting was who he appeared to be. That a dinner date was a dinner date and not the final stage of something that had been planned long before she ever heard his name. At the time Carlos Robinson was speaking publicly, there was still no death certificate for Shadeai. The medical examiner's office had not yet determined cause of death. Shadeai's family could not yet hold a funeral. Could not yet say goodbye in the formal and communal way that human beings need to say goodbye when they lose someone. That ritual, the gathering, the burial, the specific and necessary act of marking the end and honoring the life, had been delayed by the same violence that took her. And her father was still going out at night with a flashlight. Maxwell Anderson faces life in prison without the possibility of parole if convicted. That is the maximum sentence available in the state of Wisconsin, which does not have a death penalty. The case against him, based on what is publicly available, is substantial and multi-layered. The surveillance footage places him at every relevant location across a continuous timeline spanning the entire night in question and the early hours of the following morning. His phone's digital records corroborate that timeline and establish the communication history between him and Shadeai. The physical evidence recovered from his home, the blood, the gas cans, the contents of the basement, is extensive and specific. The witness at the Twisted Fisherman places them together. The confidential informant, if their testimony is admitted and survives legal challenge, speaks directly to premeditation. The state of the basement and the hole in the backyard speak to premeditation. Taken together, these are multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing in the same direction, all telling the same story, all arriving at the same conclusion. There are also questions that extend beyond the criminal case against Anderson himself. The unidentified blood in that basement represents a potential second investigation. If that blood belongs to someone whose disappearance has not yet been connected to Anderson, the scope of what is already a devastating case could expand in ways that will reshape everything we think we know about what was happening in that house. Investigators were actively pursuing that angle in the weeks following the arrest. And there are questions about the system itself. Anderson's prior convictions for domestic abuse and disorderly conduct were on the public record. His behavioral history with women was documented and adjudicated. The question of whether more forceful intervention at earlier points in that history might have changed what happened to Shadeai Robinson is a question that will take time to answer honestly and completely. But it is a question that must be asked. Because the gap between what is documented about a person's history of violence and what is accessible to ordinary people trying to make safety decisions about whether to trust them, that gap has consequences. Real, documented, fatal consequences. And it needs to be closed. Sheena Scarrow made a larger point that deserves to be amplified. Black and brown women and girls go missing in cities across the United States at rates that are not reflected in media coverage, not matched by investigative resources, not responded to with the urgency that is applied to cases involving white victims. This is documented. The disparities are real and they are studied and they have names. Researchers and advocates use the phrase missing white woman syndrome to describe the documented phenomenon by which media coverage of missing persons cases is disproportionately weighted toward white victims, while cases involving women and girls of color receive a fraction of the attention even when the circumstances are equally or more serious. Shadeai Robinson's case broke through in a way that not every case does. It reached national audiences. It prompted coverage and conversation and outrage on a wide scale. That matters. But Sheena Scarrow is right that Shadeai is not the only young black woman who has disappeared in Milwaukee in recent years. The ones who did not break through, whose cases did not go national, whose names did not trend, whose mothers did not get to appear on camera and say their daughter's name to a national audience, they deserve the same urgency. The same investigation. The same refusal to let their cases be forgotten. At The Missing Truth, we take that mandate seriously. Every missing person deserves the same quality of attention. Every family waiting for answers deserves to feel the weight of that attention. If you know of a case in your community, a woman or girl who went missing, a family still waiting, a case that has gone cold or never received adequate attention in the first place, tell us about it. Leave a comment. Reach out. We are not going to look away. There is a principle that experienced forensic investigators return to again and again, across decades of work and thousands of cases, because it keeps proving itself true in ways that more technically sophisticated methods sometimes fail to match. The principle is this: it is often the smallest, most personal, most human detail that breaks a case wide open. Not the DNA. Not the digital trail. Not the surveillance footage. The pink nail polish. When investigators working a case involving dispersed remains found across multiple locations and multiple days need to establish that those remains belong to the same individual, DNA analysis is the definitive tool. But DNA takes time. Samples need to be collected and processed and sent to a laboratory and analyzed and compared against a reference. In the early days of an investigation, DNA is a promissory note. It will give you the answer, but it cannot give you the answer right now, in the first hours when the investigation is moving the fastest and when the connection between discoveries is most urgently needed. The pink nail polish did what DNA would later confirm, but it did it faster. Two investigators looking at the leg found at Warnemont Park and the foot found near the railroad tracks could make a visual assessment, the same color, the same finish, potentially the same bottle of polish, and draw a preliminary conclusion: these two finds are connected. This is one person. This is one investigation. Not two separate incidents. One terrible night, one perpetrator, one victim. That conclusion, reached quickly and correctly, allowed resources to be concentrated and the investigation to proceed with the momentum it needed in those critical early days. There is also this. That detail told investigators something about Shadeai Robinson before they knew her name. It told them she had taken care of herself, had prepared for her evening, had painted her toenails pink before going out on a date. It gave her specificity before the DNA gave her identity. It made her a person, with routines and preferences and small, ordinary acts of self-care, before the system had formally identified who she was. And that matters. Because the dehumanizing effect of violent crime on victims is partly produced by the clinical language that surrounds them in investigative and legal contexts. Remains. Evidence. Decedent. Samples. When a detail like pink nail polish breaks through that clinical language, it reminds everyone in the room, investigator, analyst, attorney, juror, that what they are working with was a person. That it matters. That she matters. Forensics professor Joseph Scott Morgan spoke about the trace evidence principle in this context, the principle articulated by 19th-century forensic scientist Edmund Lockhart that every contact between two objects leaves a trace of that contact on both. When Anderson and Shadeai were in the same car, the same restaurant, the same basement, they left traces of themselves on each other and on every surface between them. The car fire destroyed the car. But it did not destroy everything. The dispersal of remains reduced the concentration of evidence at any single location. But it did not eliminate the trace evidence that had already been transferred in the hours those two people were together. Every contact leaves a trace. Shadeai Robinson, even after everything that was done to try to erase her, left traces. On the world she moved through. On the people who loved her. On the evidence that investigators collected and preserved. On the case that will now define the rest of Maxwell Anderson's life. She is still here. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The largest city in the state. Positioned on the western shore of Lake Michigan, a city built on manufacturing and industry and the blue-collar working-class pride that defined so much of the American Midwest throughout the 20th century. A city of neighborhoods, tight, distinct, defined neighborhoods where people have lived for generations, where the corner bar and the corner church are equally central institutions, where community is not an abstraction but a daily practice. It is also a deeply segregated city. By multiple measures across multiple decades of data, Milwaukee ranks among the most racially segregated metropolitan areas in the United States. That is a documented demographic reality with roots in the redlining practices of the mid-20th century, in the patterns of white flight that followed, in the structural economic decisions that concentrated poverty and limited opportunity in specific zip codes and kept them there across generations. That segregation has consequences that ripple through every public institution, including law enforcement, including the quality and urgency of the investigation that follows when someone from a particular zip code goes missing. When Sheena Scarrow said that there had been many black and brown girls who went missing in Milwaukee and that their cases had not received adequate attention, she was not speaking from abstract principle. She was speaking from lived experience in a city where the data on racial disparities in violence and in the response to violence is real and documented. Milwaukee has a particular history with high-profile violent crime that resonates directly with this case. Sheena Scarrow invoked that history directly. She called Maxwell Anderson a 2024 Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, the serial killer who murdered 17 men and boys in Milwaukee between 1978 and 1991, dismembering many of his victims, is inextricably associated with this city. His crimes went undetected for years in part because many of his victims were young men of color whose disappearances did not prompt the same investigative urgency that might have been afforded to victims from different demographics. That is a truth Milwaukee has been reckoning with for decades. Sheena Scarrow's invocation of Dahmer's name was not hyperbole from a grieving mother reaching for extreme language. It was a precise and intentional identification of a pattern, the pattern of a predatory individual operating in Milwaukee's black and brown communities, targeting people whose disappearances were not treated with sufficient urgency, constructing an infrastructure of violence in a residential home while neighbors went about their ordinary lives on either side of him. The question she was asking, quietly, under the surface of everything she said publicly, was whether the underlying conditions that made Dahmer possible have been sufficiently addressed in the decades since. Or whether they persist, in new forms, producing new tragedies. The answer, based on what the evidence of this case and the broader pattern of missing women in Milwaukee suggests, is that the work is not done. The behavioral science literature on predatory violence of this kind is extensive and consistent in its conclusions. The term used by investigators and analysts who have studied these patterns for decades is organized offender. An organized offender is someone who plans their crimes deliberately, who selects victims methodically, who takes specific steps to avoid detection, and who typically presents what appears to be a normal and even appealing social face to the world around them. They are not the stereotype of the obviously unstable, visibly disturbed individual that popular culture defaults to when it tries to imagine what a violent criminal looks like. They are frequently people who hold jobs and maintain social relationships and would not immediately alarm a first date. The basement is the most visible manifestation of this behavioral pattern in the Anderson case. The construction of a dedicated space for the purpose of confining and harming another person requires planning over an extended period of time. Materials need to be sourced. Work needs to be done. The space needs to be maintained in a way that can be plausibly explained to anyone who might see it. Every element of that basement, the covered windows, the door without a handle, the secondary chamber being dug beneath the first, the tools and the restraints and the sling and the drain stuffed with towels, represents a decision made in advance. A layer of preparation added over time. A physical architecture of violent intent built piece by piece in a house on South 39th Street. The victim selection process in organized offending is also typically deliberate and often prolonged. Perpetrators of this kind do not typically act on pure, sudden impulse. They identify potential targets, observe them, evaluate them, select the person they believe they can approach and gain the trust of and ultimately harm with minimal risk of detection. The investigative focus on Victor's nightclub, the venue where Anderson had worked and that Shadeai and her co-workers occasionally visited, suggests that what looked from the outside like a first date arranged through a dating application may have actually been the final stage of a selection process that had begun weeks or months earlier, in a noisy club on a Friday night in Milwaukee. Anderson may have seen Shadeai, assessed her, and then identified the digital pathway he would use to reach her on his own terms. That is a chilling thought. The idea that by the time Shadeai Robinson agreed to meet him for seafood, the decision about what he intended to do had already been made. That the dinner reservation and the drinks and the relaxed demeanor at the bar were all part of a performance that had been rehearsed, at least in his mind, long before that evening. The pre-crime disclosure to the confidential informant, telling someone what he was planning before he did it, speaks to something that behavioral analysts identify as a specific feature of this profile. The need to share the secret before it happens. The need to have at least one other person know what you are anticipating and preparing for, as if the anticipation itself is a form of performance that requires an audience. This is not impulsivity. It is the opposite. It is someone so deeply embedded in a fantasy of violent control that the planning has become as meaningful as the act itself. And it reflects an extraordinary confidence, or an extraordinary recklessness, in believing that telling someone your intentions carries no meaningful risk of consequence. That confidence has a history. It is built from the experiences of a person who was violent toward women and faced consequences that did not fundamentally change his ability to continue. From the prior convictions that resulted in nothing that permanently interrupted his freedom or his access to the kinds of social environments where he could meet new people. When the consequences repeatedly fail to fully land, some people stop believing they will. The network of ordinary witnesses who contributed to building this case is worth acknowledging at length, because it is one of the most striking aspects of how the investigation came together. The bartender at the Twisted Fisherman who knew Anderson and remembered them sitting together at the bar that evening. The maintenance worker at Shadeai's apartment building who heard her say she was excited about a first date and remembered the name she gave for her date. The neighbor whose residential security camera recorded two figures entering Anderson's backyard at 9:24 on a Monday night. The person walking in Warnemont Park on a Tuesday afternoon. The person walking along the South Milwaukee waterline on a quiet morning. The civilian volunteers who combed parks and railroad tracks and shorelines because a family needed people to look and because a father's flashlight should not be the only light searching in the dark. These are ordinary people who intersected with this tragedy in ways they did not choose and could not have anticipated, and each of them did the right thing. They looked, they reported, they cooperated, they kept searching. The pet tribute blanket that connected Shadeai's family to a specific location and led investigators to additional remains was found not by the official search operation but by family members and community volunteers who went back to an area that police had already told the family they had covered. The community found what the official search had missed. And that fact, that the gap between what the community was willing to do and what the official operation accomplished was real and had evidentiary consequences, is something that deserves to be part of every conversation about how these cases are resourced and conducted. Shadeai Robinson was a criminal justice student. She was studying, in the Applied and Practical program at Milwaukee Area Technical College, the very architecture of the system that would later be deployed to investigate her murder. Police procedure. Court processes. Forensic fundamentals. The mechanics of how a case moves from crime to arrest to prosecution to verdict. She was learning how justice works so that she could enter that system and help make it work better. She had plans. She had a road mapped out. The associate's degree was a step on that road, not the destination. Her father said she wanted to be a lawyer. She was looking at the longer arc with the clarity and patience of someone who knew exactly what she was building toward and was not in any rush to cut corners on the way there. There is something both terrible and oddly meaningful about the intersection of her academic field and the circumstances of her death. She would have understood the significance of the surveillance footage. She would have known what the DNA analysis meant and how it worked. She would have understood the evidentiary weight of the text messages and the location data and the timeline assembled from camera after camera after camera across a city that turned out to be watching the whole time. She was studying exactly this. She was preparing to work in exactly this system. And the system is now working, in her name, to do exactly what she was training to contribute to. She cannot participate. But she is present in it. Her case is the reason these proceedings are happening. Her name is at the center of every motion and every warrant and every piece of evidence entered into the record. She is, in some way that the law doesn't have formal language for, still a participant. Milwaukee Area Technical College and the community around it will have to decide how to memorialize her. Her name deserves to be somewhere in that institution, on a scholarship, a program, a room, something permanent that will remind every student who comes after her that Shadeai Robinson was here. That she worked this hard. That she was this close. That the credential they are earning was one she was 1 month away from earning when she was taken. 1 month. That is the cruelest specific detail in this entire case. Not the most graphic and not the most legally significant but the cruelest. Because it takes everything she built, the years of early mornings and late shifts and full course loads and 2 jobs and her own apartment and her own bills, and places all of it right at the threshold. Right at the line between what she had accomplished and what she was going to accomplish next. And then pulls the door shut 30 days early. 30 days. Shadeai Robinson's younger sister was 16 years old at the time of these events. 16. Still in high school. Still at the age where the world is mostly still ahead of you and the future is mostly still a positive and open abstraction. She lost her older sister, the one who graduated early, who had her own apartment, who paid her own bills, who was the model of what is possible for a person who decides to work for it. The relationship between an older and a younger sibling has its own specific character that is different from every other kind of bond. The admiration and the occasional rivalry and the deep specific familiarity of having grown up in the same house with the same parents and the same kitchen and the same combination of shared experience and separate lives. Shadeai was the trailblazer. The one who showed what was possible. And now her sister has to find a way to grow up without that example, in the shadow of that loss, in a world that has shown her something at 16 years old that 16-year-olds should not have to know in this specific and terrible way. Sheena Scarrow mentioned that she and her younger daughter were in therapy together. That is an act of profound parental care in the middle of devastating personal grief, to recognize that the daughter who is still here needs support, to provide that support, to show up for her even while drowning in the loss of the one who is gone. If Shadeai's sister ever encounters these words in any form, your sister was extraordinary. She was the kind of person the world genuinely needed more of. And the fact that she was your sister, that her values and her work ethic and her warmth were part of the air you breathed every day, means that something of her is in you. That is not a burden. It is a gift, even though right now it may feel impossible to receive. She would have wanted you to finish school. She would have wanted you to find your own path and walk down it with everything you have. She would have wanted you to be okay. Be okay. Become what you are going to become. And carry her with you. When the word justice is used in this case, and it is used constantly, by Sheena Scarrow and Carlos Robinson and everyone following this story, it is worth asking what that word actually means in this context. What would justice look like? What would it require? What would it feel like if it arrived? In the narrowest legal sense, justice means a conviction and a sentence commensurate with what was done. Life in prison for Maxwell Anderson. The removal of a dangerous person from every community he might otherwise have access to. An end to any possibility of another young woman going out for seafood on a Monday night and not coming home. That is not nothing. That is genuinely and importantly meaningful. But Sheena Scarrow was pointing towards something larger when she spoke. She was not only asking for a conviction. She was asking why this had to happen at all. What failed? Where and when? Whose prior decisions, about how domestic violence convictions are followed through on, about how missing persons cases involving women of color are resourced, about how predatory individuals are monitored after their documented behavior brings them into the system, whose decisions created the conditions in which a man with Anderson's record was still able to move freely through the world and sit at a bar with a 19-year-old girl and bring her to a basement he had spent months preparing. That kind of justice, structural and systemic and accountability at the level of institutions justice, is harder to achieve and takes longer to arrive. It requires sustained advocacy and political will and the kind of community pressure that does not let up after the trial is over and the news cycle moves on. It requires people to stay loud and stay engaged and keep asking the questions that are uncomfortable to ask and uncomfortable to answer. There is also a third dimension of justice that is harder to articulate but that I believe is carried in everything Sheena Scarrow and Carlos Robinson say when they speak publicly about their daughter. The need for her life to have meant something beyond its tragic ending. The need for Shadeai Robinson to be remembered as who she was, the young woman who graduated early, who worked 2 jobs without complaint, who dreamed of law school, who was the heart of the place, and not only as a victim. The need for her story to have a legacy that extends beyond the crime. That dimension of justice is something that communities and media and storytellers can contribute to directly. By saying her name correctly, Shadeai, not just the victim or the deceased or the decedent. By describing her fully, not only in the context of what was done to her. By insisting, in every telling of this story, that her life was the story. And her murder was what interrupted it. That is what the missing truth is committed to. Not to the crime as the story. To the person as the story. The crime is the reason we are here. But the person is the reason we care. Before I close this episode, I want to speak directly to the people at the center of it. To Sheena Scarrow, you have shown us what it looks like to refuse to be broken. You put on your daughter's earrings and you got in front of a camera and you said her name and you told her story, in grief so raw it was almost physically visible, and you did not stop. That is a form of courage that is different from every other kind, because it is not done in spite of grief. It is done in the middle of it, through it, carrying it every single second. We see you. We hear you. We will not stop. To Carlos Robinson, the image of you going out into the Milwaukee night with a flashlight, searching for your daughter, refusing to sleep, dreaming about her, needing to find her so she could rest in peace, that is one of the most profound expressions of fatherly love I have encountered in any form. You could not protect her from what happened. No one could have, not with the information available to you. But you refused to stop looking. You kept going out. You kept searching. That matters. It will always matter. To Shadeai's younger sister, you did not choose this. You do not deserve this. And you are still here, and the people who love you need you, and you will need them. Give yourself time. Be gentle with yourself. Your sister would want that for you more than anything else she could have wanted. To the community of Milwaukee that showed up, that searched and organized and refused to let this story drop, what you did was not small. You showed what a community looks like when it decides it will not accept the disappearance of one of its own into silence. Bring that energy to the next case. Every family deserves what you gave to this one. And to Shadeai. You were here. You did extraordinary things in 19 years. You graduated early. You worked without stopping. You dreamed without ceiling. You loved your family with everything you had. You were the heart of every space you walked into. You had pink nail polish on your toes and earrings on the way in the mail and a diploma 30 days in front of you and a whole enormous life waiting on the other side of it. You deserved to walk across that stage. You deserved to become the lawyer. You deserved to make whatever choice you were going to make about the Air Force. You deserved to turn 20. You deserved Mother's Day. You deserved everything. We say your name. We will keep saying it. Shadeai Robinson. Maxwell Stephen Anderson has been charged in connection with her murder. He faces the possibility of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The investigation is ongoing. The legal proceedings are ongoing. And this story will continue to be told, by her mother, by her father, by the community that loved her, and by everyone who refuses to let her name fade into silence. If you or someone you know has information about this case or about any missing persons case in the Milwaukee area, please contact the Milwaukee Police Department or submit a tip through Crime Stoppers. If you knew Maxwell Anderson and you have information about other potential victims, about incidents that may not yet have been connected to him, about the unidentified blood in that basement that belongs to someone whose family is still waiting, please come forward. Someone is waiting for answers. Someone's family has a hole in their life the shape of a person, and they need to know. To Sheena Scarrow and Carlos Robinson and every member of the Robinson and Scarrow family, your daughter is not forgotten. She is remembered. She is loved by people who never had the chance to meet her but who know who she was. We will not rest. Justice for Shadeai Robinson. If this episode moved you, if Shadeai's story reached you the way it should reach anyone who hears it, please take 10 seconds right now. Like this video. Leave a comment. Say her name. Tell us what you want us to cover next. And subscribe to The Missing Truth and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber, every share, every comment tells the algorithm that stories like this one matter. That the people behind the headlines matter. That truth matters. We do this for them. This has been The Missing Truth. We will see you in the next episode.